All right. As people start to trickle in, I want to say thank you to all of you for joining us today from across the country and the world. My name's Alexander McCobin, and I'm the CEO here at Conscious Capitalism, Inc. And just want to appreciate you for taking the time to learn and grow in community with us today. I am so excited to be joined by Simon Mainwaring to celebrate his new book, Lead with We, and to explore the future of regenerative and sustainable brands. Now, as many of you know, conscious capitalism is a philosophy that emphasizes the human nature of capitalism in business. It's a movement of business leaders around the world committed to improving both the practice and perception of capitalism to elevate humanity. And Conscious Capitalism, Inc. is a nonprofit organization dedicated to catalyzing that movement. Every week, we offer these virtual gatherings as a way for the community to see how this philosophy takes shape in the leadership journeys and business practices of those in our network. And for today's gathering, we're going to run for about 45 minutes. Simon will present for the first 20, and then we'll transition to questions for the last 20 to 25 minutes. I'll be asking some questions, but if you have any yourself at any point, please type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen so that we're able to get to as many questions from all of you as we can. Now, if you have any technical questions or issues, please email us at info@consciouscapitalism.org and we'll address them as quickly as possible. But with all those logistics out of the way, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Simon Mainwaring, the founder and CEO of WeFirst, a strategic consultancy accelerating growth and impact for purpose-driven brands. He's a New York Times bestselling author with his first book, WeFirst, and we are so excited to be here to dig deeper into his newest book just released, Lead with We, the business revolution that will save our future. Simon, welcome, and thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks, Alexander, and thank you to everyone joining. You look like you're in sunshine, and I'm in the back cave here. It looks just so different in a way. Firstly, thank you to everyone for taking time to allow me to share some thinking with you. I've been a member of the Conscious Capitalism movement now for over 10 years, and it's such a privilege to share some thinking with everyone. And I just want to and the second thing I'd like to say is that this is all about you in the sense that I'm going to share some ideas up front, but I'd really like them to be provocations for questions you might have. And so please do enter the questions in the chat, as Alexander mentioned, and we're going to take some time to, really sort of answer those questions and make sure we add value to what's going on in your world and your expression of conscious capitalism. So, I've spent the last 3 or 4 years wrestling with one issue. As somebody who has been deeply invested in conscious business for 10 years now, the thing that's kept me up at night is that we're not moving far enough or fast enough in business to meet these challenges we face with equal force. And by challenges, I mean the climate emergency, loss of biodiversity, ocean acidification, social inequities, and all the connective tissue between them all. And I say that both as a conscious business leader, but also as a dad of 2 daughters with a 22-year-old and a 19-year-old daughter, who've said to me they're not sure if they want to bring kids into the world. They're not sure if, the future is something to look forward to. And it was actually the Lancet Planetary Health Report that recently came out and said that 56% of young people around the world think humanity is doomed, which is a pretty sobering statistic when you think about it. And so I really asked myself, why? Why are we not moving far enough, fast enough? And here's some thoughts that I had. Firstly, these issues that we're solving for are not sitting there statically in the future, waiting for us to arrive and then we're going to address them. They're in fact compounding out in the future and hurtling back towards us in the present, contracting those timelines towards us. And what I see coming is this hockey stick of expectation on business, where this self-ordained luxury of choice as to how far or how fast you change your company is very quickly going to be ripped out of our hands. Why? Because employees, customers, and investors now are increasingly going to look at you and say, are you part of the problem or are you part of the solution? And so I challenged myself to think, well, based on all the work that we've done with Purposeful Brands, how do we show up differently? What do we do differently? And for me, it came down to this idea of, collectivized purpose. And what I mean by that is that we need to reimagine business itself through the lens of collaborative leadership, how we work together, how we grow and live together in new ways that actually restore and protect the natural and social systems on which all of our futures depend and on which business depends. And I spent that, the last 3 years codifying that into this, book, Lead with We, that really lays out a roadmap for how you can apply that to your business so you can actually drive growth by solving for these issues. And so let me explain some of the thinking, again, in the context of really just provoking your questions and seeing what value we can add to, what you're focused on. What's wrong with the way that business is being practiced right now? In my experience, I think there's self-imposed limits to the idea of the virtuous cycle, which has been a defining sort of, idea behind conscious business for a long time. And it's only self-limiting because in my experience, most companies limit themselves to the stakeholders that are closest into them, whether it's their suppliers, their employees, their customers, their partners. But here's the reality. When you look at the vast tapestry of business all around the world, global business, it's like this big night sky. And in that night sky, we've got these points of lights like stars that are conscious businesses. And the number of them is growing. But what we don't have is the connective tissue between their efforts. And why is that important? Again, it's about scale and speed to meet these challenges we face with these timelines contracting towards us. So the challenge I presented myself in my mind is how do we create that connective tissue between all these incredibly important conscious efforts that are going on? And so the first way I thought about that was, how do we extend beyond the sort of self-limiting approach towards, the virtuous cycle? And a core sort of wayfinding tool in my new book, Lead with We, is what I call the virtuous spiral of collectivized purpose. So not cycle, but spiral. And why spiral? Spiral actually looks at you as an individual, you as a leader inside your company, the company culture, your company community, society at large, and then a higher order transcendent practice of business. And it's really focused on pulling this commitment to the collective through all those different levels. Why? To create that connective tissue that I'm talking about so we can meet these challenges with equal force. The second piece of what I said was collectivized purpose. And what does that mean? Well, to everyone's credit, and there's a growing number of companies doing this, there's a lot of organizations, companies, startups, solopreneurs showing up and saying, okay, what's my purpose? What is my role in the world? Why does my company exist? But there are exceptions to the rule, as I mentioned. And instead, we need a new overarching narrative for business itself. So I think of this idea of collectivized purpose, where business itself is committed to restore, regenerate, and protect these systems, the whole, so that the parts can thrive. So virtuous spiral on the strength of collectivized purpose, so that business effectively becomes a movement of movements. It has its overarching narrative or role, and then within that, each company has its discrete, specific, authentic practice of its unique purpose. And when you combine those two, things can change very quickly. And I'll give you some examples so to make sense of what I mean. Firstly, why would we change? I want to explain the spiral, by the way. If you look at the spiral is an arrow pointing upwards from me to we. And then you've got the spiral wrapped around this, arrow. And we'll talk about that in more detail. But the first level is me as an individual. How do I need to show up differently? One of my concerns is that whole dialogue, the shift from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism, hasn't gone far enough. What do I mean? There's a lot of talk about the need to shift from just our fiduciary duty to shareholders to actually making sure that all stakeholders benefit in the spoils or rewards of capitalism. But what I don't hear enough of is the responsibility to the need to share in the responsibilities of stakeholder capitalism. Because the reality is this, we got in this mess together. Every little seemingly innocuous action that we took, from what car we drive, to what diet we have, to what company we work for, to where we bank our money, to where we put our 401k, every one of those decisions has aggregated or compounded to the situation we find ourselves in, which is too much carbon in the air, too many chemicals in the soil, too much plastics in the ocean. And so we need to, in the same way, use that connective tissue between all those disparate actions to our advantage, to our benefit, not our detriment. But that's not going to happen unless each of us show up. And that means me, Simon, I just pointed at myself in Zoom, which is kind of a weird thing to do. That it means Alexander. It means everybody watching today. We're going to have to make very conscious choices, because the good news is every decision you make is a lever or a chip that you're wagering on a future that you want for yourself and others. So the first part of the spiral is really about me, the individual, saying, I choose to lead. The next level is really about leadership inside a company. It could be a CEO, it could be the solopreneur, but in either case, it could still be somebody, who's just working in HR, or it could be someone in R&D, or it could be someone in sales. In my experience, typically these movements are driven by somebody, an internal champion that builds a consensus, and then it takes on a life of their own, of its own. But let me give you a couple of examples of what that leadership looks like. I mean, look at the largest retailer in the world, Walmart, that's now committed to be the world's first regenerative company, and has announced Project Gigaton, where they're working with their suppliers to take a gigaton of carbon greenhouse gas emissions out of the air. Or look at Nestle, the largest food company in the world, committing to generation regeneration. These are not only individual sort of leadership statements, but they're very powerful signals to global marketplaces as well. Because if you're going to compete in the food category, and for example, Nestle is doing X, you're going to have to ladder up what you're doing. So you've got to make the individual choice, and we're going up this arrow from me to we, individual choice, then you've got to lead inside your company. Above that, you've got the company culture. And that's when you've got your purpose inside an organization and you co-create that impact with your internal stakeholders, suppliers, and employees. A couple of examples, look at McKinsey, 1,400 employees at McKinsey recently came out and said, hey, to their leadership, we've got a concern about the type of clients we're enabling because they're enabling the climate crisis. Or, if you look at Deloitte educating its 330,000 employees around the climate crisis, or Project Gigaton with suppliers, as I mentioned, at Walmart. This is a collaborative approach inside a company to show up differently at scale. So above the culture piece, you've got the community piece, which typically you might call marketing, but I don't think of it as marketing. I think of it as community architecture. And what does that look like? Well, this is when you really create movements for change with your customer base, B2B, B2C. So think of IKEA in the UK, or actually IKEA in Europe, but even in the US now, you can actually take your furniture back and they'll buy it back from you on Buyback Friday, so that they can close the loop and have a circular economy, and also obviously de-risk their company and its reputation by making sure very large furniture manufacturer isn't having a huge carbon footprint. At the same time, they're selling renewable energy in Europe to their customers because they want to make their customers' households climate positive. So suddenly an affordable furniture maker is selling renewable energy, which positions the brand as this partner or co-creator of a future that their customers want for themselves. So many examples out there. And then above that, you've got the society level. And society is where brands, conscious businesses really take on these hard issues. And just think of P&G. I mean, there's no issue more sensitive than racial bias or racial inequality here in the US and around the world. Yet this global CPG, through its campaign, The Look, and other ads they've been doing out there, has really committed to that issue. Or look at Tony's Chocolate in the UK, which basically called out the entire cocoa industry and said, we've got to stop having slavery in our supply chain. And how did they do it? They actually went out, copied all of their competitors' products, Toblerone, Kit Kat, and so on, made an exact copy of their products, and then put them in Sainsbury's stores, but made by Tony's Chocolate. Can you imagine the legal nightmare they just created? Every legal team is like, what? What just happened? And yes, they were taken out of the stores, but not before, A, the whole industry was put on notice about slavery in its supply chain, and B, Tony's Chocolate had earned millions of dollars of earned media by raising the issue. But the point here is not these individual examples. The point here is speed and scale, going from the virtuous cycle to the virtuous spiral, to pulling up between these efforts of you as an individual, as a leader, as a company, as in your community, society, and then the world at large, pulling that connective tissue through. And at the top, you have got what I call the transcendent level of business, where we restore the harmony between humanity and the natural world. And just a couple of examples of that. I was lucky enough to be on the Cannes jury for the Sustainable Development Goals this year, and we gave the Grand Prix to the 2030 calculator, which is a very elegant, simple interface that allows any company to calculate the carbon footprint of what it makes. Why? So they're responsible, but more importantly, they can empower consumers to make more responsible choices to the environment. By the same token, you now see Walmart and P&G working together to educate consumers about more responsible, sustainable choices. Or you look at young companies like Bolt Threads, which is using mycelium to make a product called Milo, which is a leather alternative to take leather out of the auto industry, out of the fashion industry. And the beautiful thing about the Virtuous spiral is that, as is the nature of a helix or spiral, everyone's working upwards, but at the same time, those benefits are flowing down to everyone. And here's the point. The whole is breaking down so the parts can't thrive. Brands, companies can't survive in societies that fail. We are at the point of intolerance where the systems are breaking down. So we need to work together to restore those systems. And so the book Lead with We is consciously designed to be three things. A point of departure where your whole mindset is you want to lead with as many people as possible to benefit the greatest we. And it's also a process. So how you get it done is collaborative with as many stakeholders as possible, including pre-competitive collaboration with competitors in your industry, as well as cross-sector alliances. And then it's also an end state. It's an aspiration, a higher order aspiration, where we redefine what success and growth looks like, which is really restoring the integrity of the whole so that we can have a future to look forward to. But in its essence, at its simplest, the thing I challenge myself with is all of this stuff can be very wonkish and alienating, even for your own employees, let alone consumers. It all just seems a bit too hard to get their head around, whether it's the Sustainable Development Goals, B Corp, ESG, environmental, social, governance metrics, and so on and so on. We need a simple way of just asking ourselves one question whenever we make any decision in any company of any size, no matter where you sit. And that is, how do I, A, lead, like consciously choose to lead on this issue with this decision, B, with as many people as possible, C, to benefit the greatest number of people on the planet. And so it's very consciously designed as a very accessible, universal, but very versatile tool, a decision-making filter that you can use. And, before we go to questions and chatting with Alexander, I would say this. This is not the end of something. We are not in the last chapter of humanity's best days and the planet is going to fall apart. We are at the beginning of this miraculous rebirth of business, which is appropriately painful, like any birth, but it's the beginning of an era for business where we are going to start working with the natural world rather than against it. We're going to start serving, the living systems rather than stealing from them. And my prediction is what's going to happen is that we are going to give the natural world a much better chance of revealing to us its inherent, abundant, regenerative capacity. And it is going to dazzle us with how it can quickly restore itself, as we saw during the beginning of COVID, with habitats coming back to life. Rivers, I believe the Thames River in London now, actually you can see living things in it, which is a miracle. It's not just that brown, green thing that just sort of lurches past us all. And we're going to be dazzled by what it can actually do. And we're going to fall in love with the natural world all over again. Conscious businesses around the world are going to look around and say, look at all these biological blueprints that we've looked past and we've squandered and destroyed in many cases. And we will realize we can solve for everything we need in our lives while also serving nature. But I deeply believe that we're only going to get there and we're only going to have that experience if we choose to work together to that end. And that's why we need to lead with we. So I'd love to go back to Alexander, and hopefully that provoked a few questions and see what comes to mind.
Simon, thank you for not only writing the book and sharing this with us, but really being a leader in this area. And there's so much that I would love to dive into here, but I want to start with one thing that you said that really piqued my interest, which was you said we should look at business as a movement of movements.
Yeah.
And I think there's so much power in that I'd love for you to actually take another minute or two to really unpack what you mean by that.
Sure. And I'll give you a concrete example in the work we've done at WeFirst. So it's not just theory. I mean, intellectually, we can understand that there is sort of a foundational platform, a movement. For example, Conscious Capitalism, it's a movement in its own right. You know, there's immortalized in the books that have been written and so on. And above and beyond that, you've got all the different members of the community, including myself, that are going out and doing something their own way, that are making a difference to something specific to what they're doing. You know, I'll give you an example in the business world. We work with VF Corporation, which is a $14 billion apparel company. And they had a purpose statement that they needed rolled out. And they had 26 brands at that time, including Vans, the North Face, Timberland, and many others that we know. Rather than seeing that as a top-down prescriptive experience where, you know, it's a mistake a lot of companies make. They map their hierarchical top-down mindset from their org structure or supply chain across to how they activate their purpose or conscious business. Instead, you need to turn that upside down and say the enterprise is the foundational platform on which the brands stand. And so, you know, they had a movement around the betterment of people and planet at VF Corp, but then Vans had their own specific purpose. Timberland had their own specific purpose, and North Face, and so on and so on. And that doesn't just occur at a sort of enterprise and portfolio level. It's also in the venture world, the private equity, where those firms are reimagining themselves right now. And they're saying, hey, we've got to show up in a new way, and we've got to attract the right portfolio companies that we want. And then each one of those companies is like an arrow in our quiver that goes out into the world and makes a difference. And when you start to look at whatever you're doing, however you're collaborating, whether it's in the context of an enterprise, a private equity or venture partner, or as a movement like Conscious Capitalism, suddenly you're constantly overlaying this connective tissue, this fabric between everybody's efforts, especially when you expand your aperture or the way you think about things and you go, oh, I'm going to work with my competitors and level up the game, like the Sustainable Apparel Coalition or so many other things. Or, you know, whether you look at cross-sector collaboration, we're going to advocate for policy and regulatory change that's going to reward and incentivize these new, these new approaches. And so we need to stop thinking about a finite shift from doing less bad to more good to, you know, who we were as a company to who we want to be as a company, and realize, wait a second, let's blow that out of the water and say we are all in a collaborative movement to restore the very life support system that makes our future possible. And so we're going to blur these distinctions between us and competitors, between sectors, between our previous thinking and where we are now, and we're going to be more expansive in our ambition.
I love that, Simon. Thank you so much. And a lot of the examples that you're giving are of these large companies, you know, sure. Nestle and other multinationals. And for some people who are listening, it might seem almost insurmountable for them at whatever size company they have, if they're not in a multinational company, don't have such a significant impact on the world to contribute to this. What advice would you give, or what's the calling for smaller, mid-sized companies with this as well?
Well, if you're a smaller or mid-sized company like WeFirst is, you're lucky, you're better off. I mean, the only reason I use these big company examples is because everyone goes, oh, wow, okay, I know who that is and they're doing it. So that lends some credibility to the argument. But also they have all the inertia of legacy thinking. They have all the inertia of capital investments and supply chains and old practices. And they have all the inertia of big boards and senior leadership teams and ELTs that are sitting there going, well, should we really do this? So they can do it. Anyone can. I think it's much more fun and much more exciting and possible in a way to be a speedboat rather than a battleship. So all of us as smaller companies, we should not only be a speedboat in our own right, but let's be a flotilla. I've never used this metaphor before, so I hope it plays out. You never know, it could go south really quickly. And we've all got to, all get pointed in the same direction. But the principles apply large or small companies. The principles really are, if you want to start driving growth for your business, building your reputation, attracting the talent you want, innovating and making products that people are going to want to buy. If you want to build your bottom line moving forward, you've got to do a very sober self-audit of how your company's showing up and look at what you can improve. You've got to define your purpose, and then you've got to bring that to life as a conscious business with your internal stakeholders and external stakeholders. And the reason I say that it's such sort of passion is that we are at this horrible but glorious moment in business where doing good is actually being reinforced by market forces. For the first time ever, we have leadership, suppliers, employees, customers, consumers, but investors, the investor class, institutional investors and retail investors coming along and saying, we want to enable companies that are making good for you, good for the planet products. So we can lean into our instincts, our innate goodness as conscious business leaders and say, oh my God, this is a moment in time where this works for us. We're not the exception to the rule anymore. We're on the right side of history. So, I think we should all just go like hell right now.
Fantastic. And we're already getting a lot of questions to roll in. So while I have more that I'd like to ask, I want to make
Sure.
sure that we get to as many from people who are listening as we can. And so I want to start with Eric Moss, who says that according to the Harvard Law School Forum on Corporate Governance, the median tenure of S&P 500 companies has decreased from 6 to 5 years between 2013 and 2017 and sees that continuing to go down.
Yeah.
How can sustainable businesses and conscious businesses continue in light of this trend?
The churn in the S&P 500, firstly, I want to kind of call out one thing, which is just a general comment. The S&P 500, the stock market being the bellwether of what success looks like, the GDP actually measuring economic health. I think these are all false premises because they don't take in the natural capital. They don't take in holistic well-being. We've been sort of seduced to think that if the markets are doing well or the S&P 500 is doing well, then we're all doing well. But that's not the way capitalism is being experienced by the vast number of people around the world. It's not serving enough people well enough, and we need to repurpose that. But I'll put that aside. I think, what we need to recognize is that three things exist together that have never happened before, and this is going to drive your growth as a sustainable business despite that churn that you talk about. We have the stakes existing for the first time, which is humanity is facing an existential crisis. So we're all paying attention in a way that we weren't in the 50s since Buckminster Fuller, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2010s and so on. Secondly, stakeholders are at the table. As I mentioned, finally the investor class is here. And until the investor class was here, we never really had a viable alternative to the engine of capitalism because we had a big piece missing. But now it's here and we can finally offer that. And then thirdly, we've got the story, a new narrative for business that's coming from Larry Fink at BlackRock to B Corps to Business Roundtable CEOs to Mark Benioff at Davos to all the leaders at the COP26 last week. So we have this new, when you have the stakes, the story, and the stakeholders, then you can actually feasibly, for the first time, consider that this is actually, it's possible to do this. And then coming back to your question, I think, it's interesting. We have to do this, because these issues are so urgent, but I don't look at it that way. I look at it and go, every one of these challenges is a marketplace opportunity in disguise. And Bill Gates came out a couple of weeks ago and he said, there's going to be 10 Teslas and a Google and a Microsoft and more created by climate tech alone to solve for these issues. So coming back to the S&P 500, it's not about that. I believe that the most iconic brands of the future will be those with the greatest social impact. And let me give you a couple of examples and then I'll stop because I want this to be real. Just look at, in the last 5 to 10 years, the shift in clean beauty, where every beauty brand is now talking about taking chemicals out of their products or plastic out of their supply chain. Look at clean food, where if you go into an Air One or to a Whole Foods or whatever else it might be, it's like a Vegas of making your life better. I mean, it's crazy now. You look at sustainable apparel, footwear and apparel, every brand falling over themselves as to their supply chain credentials and net positive and so on. And look at the auto industry, the most entrenched industry in the US. 10 years ago, they tried to put Tesla out of business. 10 years later, Elon Musk, other issues aside, is the richest man in the world, arguably on his way to being a trillionaire. And every major automaker in the US has made commitments to phase out combustion engine vehicles and transition to alternative energy. These are marketplace opportunities. So if you want to thrive in the context of something like the S&P 500, although I think there's some false premises there, as I said, recognize these challenges as marketplace opportunities. Collaborate as widely and as openly as possible to scale your impact, and that in turn will drive your growth. And then by whatever metric we measure success, you'll be at the forefront.
Fantastic. And That's actually a great segue into a question from the other side of the coin, not just the leaders of companies, but
Sure.
Inga Intriago says, "Hello, Simon. Thank you so much for such an insightful presentation. What advice can you give to employees that want to lead and get a following on this movement, but may worry about management or leadership and navigating that?"
Yeah. We have spent 10 years in small company or big company hostile boardrooms, leadership rooms, where they're like, exactly why is this important again? Do we really need to be a conscious business? Yeah, we'll get to that later. You know what I mean? Like, totally get it. Here's what we do that we find is effective. And if you're an employee in a company, this is what I would recommend you do. Firstly, you've got to recognize that you need to meet your leadership or your fellow colleagues where they are. You can't be that preachy kind of soapbox person telling them how they need to change or what they need to think or care about. It's going to backfire. Instead, really look at what they're struggling with. It might be reputation, it might be differentiation in the marketplace, it might be talent churn due to the great resignation, it might be building a resilient culture because of, COVID-19, so many issues. Then, with that as context, do three things. Show them the research, the business case for being a more conscious business. So you've got all the books in the Conscious Capitalism library. You've got consultants out there like Deloitte with their Purpose Premium that summarizes all the data. It's all there. It's overwhelming now. That ship has sailed. Get all that research. Secondly, do a competitive audit and have a look at the competitors in the industry and just say, hey, listen, for what it's worth, this is what B2B, B2C, this is what the other companies are doing. And that sort of taps into their competitive instinct. And they sort of go, oh, all right, well, they're making either an informed decision or they're as crazy as you are. And, it gives people pause. And then thirdly, do a double-barreled thing, which is do a cost-benefit analysis of doing it. So what's it going to cost us to become a more conscious business and to rally around this internally? Or what's the benefit of doing it? But also what is the cost of not doing it? Loss of reputation, loss of relevance, talent churn, whatever it might be, and the cost and the benefit of not doing it. We can just sit on our hands and sit back and put our hands behind our head and see what happens. So research, competitive audit, cost-benefit analysis of doing it and not doing it. And invariably, in our experience, whether you're an employee, a CEO, a founder with a small team, people are given pause because you're really approaching it from all angles in the context of what they're worried about right now. And they can see how it can be a solution to that concern. And the data and the competitors and the cost-benefit analysis is self-evident. And it may not be immediately, but pretty quickly they start to come around and say, hey, let's talk a little bit more about this and so on. And all I would say is that the biggest obstacle there is not the leadership team. It's not your fellow employees. It's your willingness to really listen to what they're concerned about, to put the work in to build out that business case for them, and then to keep that ball alive, to keep the balloon in the air, to keep the momentum going when you face a lot of obstacles internally because you're trying to course correct a ship, you're trying to turn it around. So even if you get it off the ground, 3 months later, there's a problem. 6 months later, there's a problem. So it's that long-term maintenance. So really the challenge is your own in a lot of ways.
There's so much to unpack there, Simon. And there's a question from Miran Aka that I think kind of builds on that, where Miran says it's lonely out there as a business and is wondering how she can inspire and encourage other businesses around to join this movement, perhaps in one's own city or with other businesses in the same community.
Yeah, it's a great question. We're all lonely. We're all one glass of white wine away from crying. I think that's kind of where we're all at after 18 months of COVID. It's interesting. I would challenge you in a way. It is lonely if we choose to be that way. And that sounds cheeky, but it's not meant to be that. Being optimistic is a choice. If we're pessimistic or lonely or this or that, then it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. We're compounding the problem. It's over. We're done. Things are going to get worse and we're going to point fingers at each other and it's over. But you can consciously choose to be optimistic, and in turn, you'll do a little bit, someone else will do a little bit, you'll connect to somebody else doing a little bit and so on, and it will compound. That's why the conscious capitalism community is so important. You have this community of people who will keep your head on straight when the world looks like it's going mad. You'll be able to lean into them. You have all the, the senior leadership network and all the resources there and all of those things that will encourage you. Like you, when I've been going through COVID, just going back and seeing people in the real world for the first time, people who care about the same thing, was like water in a desert. It was like, oh my God, thank you, because I'm not crazy, and I needed that connective tissue and I needed that inspiration. So I would encourage you to acknowledge that it can be lonely, but it doesn't have to be. And the antidote for that is this community and participating more and really reaching out for those 2 or 3 like-minded people and investing time in those relationships and saying, what are you doing? What's working? What's not? What could we look at? What more could we do together? And after a while, you'll be swimming in this ocean of people who care about the same things. You won't be as lonely. You'll be crazy together, which is awesome because you think the future can get better. And I think that won't just help solve for our future, but it will solve that loneliness for you. But you have to be intentional about it. You have to choose to be positive. You have to go and seek them out, and you have to participate in the community.
Again, as always, Simon, thank you for that. I think that is so wise and on point. And I do want to invite everyone with that amazing plug for Conscious Capitalism to get more involved with Conscious Capitalism if you haven't yet, to participate in more of these virtual gatherings, join the Senior Leader Network, or participate in a chapter event around you. There is an incredible community of business leaders who want to support you and help you introduce this to other business leaders as well, so that you don't feel lonely and we do make a change for this to become the norm for business. So now, we have an anonymous attendee who has an interesting question, Simon, that while your mix of customers moves to being more conscious, how do you make your own conscious approach to business a true competitive advantage versus less conscious competitors?
Yeah, it's a double-edged sword. Business has woken up to the urgency around these issues. So now you've got nonprofits you've got to compete with for mind share in a way in terms of having a positive impact, but you've got all these for-profits, especially in your own industry, all effectively talking a good game, using similar language. So when we've worked with folks like Timberland and other things like that, they've actually come to us and said, hey, a lot of the language that used to differentiate us is effectively meaningless now because everyone's using the same language. So a couple of things. Firstly, mistake number 1. Do not mistake the cause that you're working towards as your purpose. Whether you're a nonprofit or for-profit, we often see that people will say, oh, okay, what is company X about? What is your company about? Oh, we're all about solving loneliness or childhood mortality or access to clean water or whatever it might be. That's the category of the impact you want to have, but it's not your unique purpose. It needs to be unique to your company and the role it's going to play. And it needs to be articulated in a way that's specific enough to differentiate you from competitors. Otherwise, you'll just get lost in the noise. And I want to double down on this a couple of other ways. When people ask you about the good work you want to do, you might say that you're, a conscious company, or you might be a B Corp, or you might be something else out there. What that does is it raises awareness of conscious capitalism or the SDGs or whatever else it might be, but it doesn't help people understand why they should invest in, work for, buy from your company. So too often we see that companies mistake their cause for their purpose and they don't articulate it in a specific and differentiated way. Or when they are doing good, they rely too heavily on these different categories which then builds those categories and doesn't build your brand. So the more that you can be specific about not only what impact you want to have, but your point of view on that issue or impact, the more differentiated you will be. And then all of these things, like being a member of the Senior Leadership Network and so on, it's all social proof of the commitment of your company. And I say that because too often we speak to companies and they say, listen, we've been doing good. We've been doing all this social content. We gave all this money away to all these different things. We're showing up differently. We fixed our supply chain. It's 3 years down the track and no one is any more aware of what we're doing than they were 3 years ago. And it's typically because they're just talking in generic category, broader terms, and people don't actually see what's specific about you. And so I think 2 distinctions to your question. Being a conscious company or non-conscious, unconscious, is a key distinction. But within the conscious company sort of category, you've got to be as specific and differentiated as you can be. And then with that point of view articulated, you've got to share a simple, consistent, and scalable story. You've got to say one thing well. And I'll give you one example and then I'll stop. Airbnb, their whole commitment is to universal belonging. Now, universal belonging can take the form of accommodation in Paris at an apartment or a house where you stay. It also takes the form of free accommodation for Syrian refugees or victims of bushfires or firefighters in Australia and California through their Open Homes program. It also takes the form of a Super Bowl ad all about inclusion. As long as you have a unique articulation, a simple, consistent, and scalable story that is, really authentic to you, you can bring it to life over time in many different ways, but you've got to keep ringing that same bell so that people start to understand what you're about. Why? So they can talk about you to others effectively. So a lot of competition out there. Be specific, simple, consistent, scalable story, and then bring it to life in lots of different ways where they're like chapters in a longer story arc.
Brilliant. And Diane Suter has a question that builds on something that you were saying there that you started to touch on, but would love for you to go a little more in depth with.
Sure.
Where Diane says, it's great that the Business Roundtable, Larry Fink at BlackRock, and others are finally talking about stakeholders versus shareholders and getting into different, how they're presenting themselves and what they're saying. But are they actually doing anything about it? Or is this a marketing statement, not moving the movement towards solving our challenges?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot been written both about BlackRock recently, and I mentioned it in the book as well, that as I understand it, and forgive me if I misquoted, there's about $80 billion still committed in the assets under management that they have, which is over $10 trillion that are committed towards oil and gas. And that's been called out in a lot of press, Wall Street Journal and others. So, this is a complicated issue. No one gets off the hook. You've got to walk your talk. At the same time, there's been this flight of capital to ESG funds out there. And it's almost like the shiny new squirrel. Everyone's like, oh yeah, we're putting all our money towards ESG. But there's been a huge shakeout there because a lot of people have been saying that, ESG factors in a lot of intangibles that you can't then measure. So the superior returns are actually fabricated, or people have just been repurposing, or just renaming existing funds as ESG to capture that new interest. So whether it's an individual sort of, money management firm or whether it's, the whole category of funds itself, it's all shaking out. What I would say is here's where we can take heart. Our BS radar is so highly attuned now wherever we sit in society. We have, the media will call you out. As I mentioned, as we've seen with BlackRock and, the distinction I mentioned in the book about, okay, you've got to be able to kind of show up consistently across your whole portfolio. You've also got, employees that will call you out. I mean, just look about in the last year. We've got Amazon, Google, Facebook. I mean, look at the whistleblower at Facebook. Look at the employees at McKinsey I mentioned earlier on. Everyone is calling out their own company from the inside for showing up in disingenuous ways. Then, of course, you've got customers or consumers that will call you out. So I would take heart, Diane, from the fact that there is nowhere to hide if you're a CEO or a CFO or a CSO. Your investor, your customer, your consumer, your employee, someone in your supply chain will call you out. And that is good news for everybody. And it's going to be painful. It's going to shake out for a lot of people. We see it in the ESG debate now. And here's the other course correcting factor. The climate crisis doesn't care whether you're trying to lie or not. It's here. It's real. If you look at what the UN said a couple of weeks ago at COP, they said, we're on track for a 2.4 degrees Celsius rise in global temperature. And that's going to be catastrophic in their terms. So if we want to play at these things, we can play all day, but we're going to have no one to blame but ourselves when these chickens come home to roost, quite honestly. And so I think the tolerance for, purpose washing, conscious washing will, diminish. And I think the scrutiny will increase, but the reality of the results we're getting is really going to win the day.
Simon, I wish we had more time to ask so many more questions of you, but I want to respect your time and just say, I think that's a great ending point for us. So really, thank you for writing this book, for all the work that you're doing, and for sharing all of this with the Conscious Capitalism community today.
Thank you so much, and thank you for including me in the community for so long. It's been a privilege over the last decade, and just look forward to being a part of it with everybody else. Let's all get more involved. We can do this if we do it together. So let's go like hell.
Here, here, let's go like hell. And for everyone who's been with us, thank you so much for joining us today. In the chat box, you should have a link to a survey. If you could take 30 seconds to just give us feedback, it will help us plan future programming and keep providing even more value for you to get connected with the conscious capitalism community.
And Alexander, I might mention one more thing to that end. This sounds like it's shamelessly self-serving in terms of the book Lead with We, but I put it together to save everyone the hassle of trying to think through all of this. Like, we've been lucky enough for 10 years to kind of work out what works and what doesn't. And so we created this step-by-step roadmap in the book. So I would encourage you, if you're interested, to grab a copy for yourself, because it'll save you so much grief and it'll show you how to drive growth in these challenging times. Also, if you get a chance, give it to an entrepreneur or a corporate leader out there that you think might be interested. The larger point is this: we've just got to do it together. So if that can be a tool to that end, I'd love it to be helpful.
I encourage everyone to do the same thing. And so, Simon, where can people find the book?
The book is up on Amazon now. It only came out last week, Lead with We. Or if you want more information about it, you can go to leadwithwe.com. But, hey, it's Christmas. What the hell? Give it to your employees, give it to your boss. But, there's a lot of insight in there that can give you a plan to follow. And I think that's absolutely crucial to build your reputation, strengthen your culture, be resonant with consumers, and drive your bottom line by solving for these issues. That's the big opportunity in front of us if we get ahead of it.
Hear, hear. Again, Simon, thank you for joining us. Everyone, thank you for being with us today. Any final comments, Simon?
No, just, I think we have three. No, my comment would be this: be optimistic. Be optimistic. We have never had young people like we have today. We've never embraced innovation like we have today. We never had the wake-up call of COVID-19. We've never had communities like Conscious Capitalism. If you put any one of these to the forefront, we can transform our future. You put them all together, and this is ours to lose. And so rather than listen to negative talk about COP26 or what was or wasn't done, or be disheartened or be lonely, let's show up differently. Not just on our own, but with each other, because our intent, the integrity of our intent, will translate into action, and that will define our result. So I really mean it. It's up to us from an inside out point of view to choose to lead and to do it together.
I think that's a fantastic note to end on. With that, thank you again, everyone. Have a great day.
Simon,
good luck with the rest of the book tour.
Thank you.